Hello everyone, today we read the first paragraph of the third chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title of the chapter being Art or Science War, and the title of the paragraph Usage, Still Unsettled, in brackets, Power and Knowledge, Science when mere knowing, Art when doing is the object. The text follows. The choice between these terms seems to be still unsettled, and no one seems to know rightly on what grounds it should be decided, and yet the thing is simple. We have already said elsewhere that knowing is something different from doing. The two are so different that they should not easily be mistaken the one for the other. The doing cannot properly stand in any book, and therefore also art should never be the title of a book. But because we have once accustomed ourselves to combine in conception under the name of theory of art, or simply art, the branches of knowledge, which may be separately pure sciences, necessary for the practice of an art, therefore it is consistent to continue this ground of distinction and to call everything art when the object is to carry out the doing, being able or power, as for example art of building. Science when merely knowledge is the object, as science of mathematics, of astronomy. That in every art certain complete sciences may be included is intelligible of itself, and should not perplex us, but still it is worth observing that there is also no science without a mixture of art. In mathematics, for instance, the use of figures and of algebra is an art, but that is only one amongst many instances. The reason is that however plain and palpable the difference is between knowledge and power in the composite result of human knowledge, yet it is difficult to trace out their line of separation in man himself. So finally we reached the third chapter of the second book, and in here von Clausewitz explains fundamentally what are we talking about, where's the problem at the end of the day in the confusion between in the definition of art in the place of science of war, or vice versa, right? So the concept here is important because we have already observed naturally what's the difference between science, intended just as a knowledge, and art, which entails power, action. Here the English translation is also translated as doing, but also power, actually being able, right, is the point, right? You can know something, but effectively not being able to translate that knowledge in something useful in practice, which can happen not much because of the knowledge in itself, but actually of other elements that stand in the way. And this is really the concept that lays behind here, meaning that knowledge, of course, is limited also in itself. So there is already this first boundary. You can definitely expand, but you can also restrict, and also we must be aware of this, that not all what we know is constantly the same. It evolves, and this may not necessarily evolve for the better, right? But this is kind of a philosophical ground. Maybe we don't really care. Here, from a strictly scientific point of view, we have to acknowledge that albeit we know something, this knowledge is imperfect most of the times, and also we may lack the effective means, which doesn't even mean the instruments, but sometimes just the resources to apply that knowledge and to obtain something with it. So von Clausewitz here phrases it like usage is still unsettled, this term of art or science, and then says power, knowledge, science when mere knowing, art when doing is the object. Right? This is the sharp differentiation. Science when mere knowing, art when doing is the object. And then he goes on in the text and starts by saying, the choice between these terms seems to be still unsettled at the time, but don't think that at this point it has really changed. And quote, and no one seems to know rightly on what grounds it should be decided, and yet the thing is simple. It really is, right? And then he goes on and says, we have already said elsewhere that knowing is something different from doing. Or kenning, I would say in English, my raping English. And the two are so different that they should not easily be mistaken the one for the other. Right? And there is objectively a very sharp distinction, because von Clausewitz writes, quote, the doing cannot properly stand in any book, and therefore also art should never be the title of a book. But because we have once accustomed ourselves to combine in conception under the name of theory of art, or simply art, the branches of knowledge, which may be separately pure sciences necessary for the practice of an art, therefore it is consistent to continue this ground of distinction, and to call everything art when the object is to carry out the doing, being able, as for example, art of building. Science, when merely knowledge is the object. So, before this last part, what von Clausewitz is saying, yeah, you can call an art also that set of knowledge that you require, definitely, to carry out what you're doing, right? This is particularly important. I mean, no art is valid without knowledge, right? And the other way around, like, there is nothing like pure knowledge as such, at least in our world, in our existence. Our mind works because we have not just a software but a hardware at the same time, and therefore what we get from our senses is what we feed our mind with, right? We don't know exactly what happens at the level of the mind in this regard to make that eventually knowledge that is eventually newly applicable to reality, but so it is. So what von Clausewitz is saying, there may be this, formal confusion, maybe at the point in which we decide to write something that is a manual, essentially. It tells you how you should do certain things, which contains in itself the knowledge, sometimes not even explicitated, of every let's say, element, every knowledge that you, every science, that you need for that. I mean, in a book of chemistry, you don't get the laws of physics repeated, right? Largely, yes, too, but that's a book of chemistry, right? That's not even properly an art, right? But yet there are examples, for example. Oh my god, this my English today really sucks more than the usual. But I think you got the point, right? If you have a treaty of architecture, well, yeah, you probably talk a lot about physics too, but still the fundamentals of physics are in another book. So, yet they are entailed in that treaty, right? So you essentially make reference to other sciences that are pure knowledge in this regard, and that's why von Clausewitz makes this example, or approximately pure knowledge, let's say, of the science of mathematics and of astronomy, right? And also in here, telling the truth, it's not that simple, because mathematics in absolute terms becomes that fundamentally, because mathematics is really purely scientifical, if you want. It doesn't require a practical demonstration. Even when you draw, I don't know, a geometry theorem on the board, you need that to explain it better, but you can formulate that conceptually without a necessarily practical example, and that's how mathematics is built largely. Then there are other extensions of mathematics that feel, of course, in very concrete ways, in very concrete reality. But what's the same definitions? What's a unity? these are all theoretical ideas, right? What's a point? What's a line? What's a surface? We don't demonstrate them. We give them for granted, right? Also, astronomy is a bit different, though, because astronomy can at least be observed. I mean, we're still talking about something we can evidently see as objects, as celestial bodies, and then also we need a certain amount of instruments to effectively acknowledge their existence. So astronomy in itself is already something more complicated, but you don't actually apply astronomy to something. You just know that it is, and you basically just can interfere with it, or let's say getting something from it, but not applying astronomy. And von Clausewitz, just to dispel further, conceptual, problem, says that in every art, certain complete sciences may be included is intelligible of itself, as we have seen, and should not perplex us. So let's not make let's not have too much trouble about it, aside from the way I'm trying to poorly explain it. But von Clausewitz says, but still, it is worth observing that there is also no science without a mixture of art, right? And that's exactly what we were saying here. Like, you can't think humanly that even mathematics, that is pure knowledge in this regard, is devoid of a % of an art that revolves around it, because just cognitively speaking, right, even if it's just all mental, it still passes through certain realizations that are not just a cascade of knowledge into your brain. Like, you have really to apply and to think about it, and to find points of reference around you in the world you live in. And von Clausewitz goes on, says, in mathematics, for instance, the use of figures and algebra is an art, right? Because it does entail certain means of representation and of calculation, as we have exemplified it before, right? So even the triangle drawn on the board to demonstrate a rectangle triangle, the Pythagoras theorem, well, that's much better explained on a board, let's say, and it does require some spatial notion that you have derived before the knowledge of mathematics as, in fact, as a science, as a taught science, right? And this is very interesting, because that's the point of mathematics, that is actually here in order to describe essentially the world we live in, which is never fully true, but it follows certain lines that tend to the infinite to it, right? So our mathematics does work. There is not much to say about. I mean, there would be a lot to tell about it too, but in practice, what do we need mathematics for, and why we have developed this? Mathematics is essentially a human language to describe the world around us, right? That seems to have, in this sense, certain laws regulate them that are, maybe we talk about in physics. Even in there, there are laws, but sometimes we are open to the idea that it can also change at a certain level. But here, once again, it's a bit too complicated to spend in the idea of what is a theory in this regard. But we are not interested in that, because once again, von Clausewitz here is not making a point against nor mathematics nor the actual importance of it, and of knowledge and of science as such, but it's simply saying that if you want it to be of practical use, you have to approximate it at some level, or better, you have to rely on certain capacities that, in a sense, go beyond sometimes your intellectual skills, right? It's not intuitive, in fact, without picturing certain things visually, to understand certain of these concepts. So there is always a way through which we learn them, and this does require an art, right? And von Clausewitz says then the reason is that however plain and palpable the difference is between knowledge and power in the composite results of human knowledge, yet it is difficult to trace out their line of separation in man itself. And that's in fact the point, right? Where is that we actually separate fully science from art? We basically never do that, because we are constantly referring to the idea that you think something in the very moment in which you do it, you're aware of it, and yet that is always directed to a practical use in some way. So this is meaningful because it shows in the Clausewitzian thought that actually the Vom Kriege is deeply rooted in scientific thought, right? Von Clausewitz was pretty aware of the main scientific accomplishments of his times. He studied physics, natural law, pretty much, and he realizes that in every knowledge there is always element of applicability, we can say, and that knowledge per se has a use only when you apply it to reality. It may sound all very, I don't know whether if you were here, maybe it's the first video you ever hear about this series, you think, well, thanks to my eyes. Well, but we have seen in the previous videos how essentially knowledge without practical application can be good, but it basically remains aside. Well, this is the same thing that the theory of the art of war has in comparison to the application of that, of how you command effectively an arm. What does this mean? It means that when you think of certain general principles that can regulate at best this realm, well, when you get to war and to social sciences in general, you can't even have a sound scientific awareness of the world, but still the means of measurement and how they interfere can be completely out of practice of reality. So in order to found an action over simple science, well, you always have to cope with the reaction of reality in this regard. And you can't do as if that didn't exist. You'll meet this wall, this resistance in some way, and you have to overcome it, right? And acquiring a set of knowledge that at that point is bent, we can say, to the practical application, more than the theoretical abstraction. And we have spent all the previous the previous chapter to observe how this is the case when you want to come up with a theory of the art of war. You can't start by abstracting and therefore tending towards science, purely thinking that that will solve the problem, because it's like pretending perfection from, I don't know, scientific measurement. But scientific measurement is also much easier, right, depending on how you employ the instruments, etc. When you deal with such enormously complicated systems, like even just 10 people interacting on each other, well, the problem is that you lack a pattern, you lack a formula, you lack a model that you can use, if not dictated by experience, that you can applicate to those people. And yet it's never going to be ultimate, it's never going to be perfect, right? And this imperfection is going to be ever larger the more the system increases in size. So this is I don't know how consistent this explanation I've given today of this paragraph is, but the concept, as you understand here, is much simpler than it seems. We are constantly wired to a scientific and to a practical dimension. We can't separate them, but we have always to bear in mind that they are two different fields, that you can know a lot, but you may not be able to turn that knowledge into practice, not because of much of how faulty the knowledge is only, which is often the case, and especially in war this is very evident, but also because you're going to meet a resistance in the field of application, right? So yeah, this was properly it, and it's actually, I mean, today this video is pretty short because actually the concept in this paragraph that is longer than the others we have read, but it's really just one line, just one shot. It all follows the same pattern, let's say. So yeah, I think we can stop here, and we will go on. Next paragraph is on the difficulty of separating perception from judgment, which starts being a bit more interesting, and we'll go on. This chapter is really fascinating. However, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.